Lately, I've been trying to send you stories every day, but I feel like a large number of people who have signed up almost never come back to listen to the stories. I don't know where that is. Make you unhappy? I hope to receive comments and suggestions from you, and if you find the video good, please give me a like to give me more motivation. For those who have not yet subscribed, don't forget to click the subscribe button and press notification bell to wait for the next story. Now let's get into the story. Story 1. I was sitting in my room one evening, after getting home from work, on the second floor. My little brother is downstairs watching TV, and our dog is in the hallway outside my bedroom door, sleeping. All of a sudden, our dog starts making all kinds of racket, jumping around, barking, even kind of howling. I go to get up to see what's going on, and I hear, "That's a good girl," in a deep, male's voice. It was definitely not my little brother, so I shout, "Oh, you're home early," thinking that it's my dad's friend, our roommate. I open the door. As soon as I'm out there, I see that there is no one at all, but the dog, wagging her tail, staring at the empty end of the hallway. My little brother comes upstairs, and he says that he heard the same voice, thinking that it was me. We checked the entire house, and found no one. This happened many years ago, and I don't at all feel like it was a misunderstanding, or that my brother and I thought that we heard something, but were mistaken. Someone was in our house that night. Story 2. When I was 15, I was on a date with this girl who lived in my neighborhood. All we did was sit at the park near our houses and talk, and when the sun went down, we left. As I was walking her back to her house, we walked under a huge oak tree, and because it was so dark, we didn't see the massive spider web. We walked right into the middle of it, and of course, freaked out. Eventually, we felt that we got all the webs off of us, and I continued walking her to her house. When I eventually got home, I got right in the shower. As I stood under the water looking down, I saw a huge brown wolf spider fall onto the shower floor and go down the drain. The next day, I saw the girl at school. She told me that that morning, she took a shower, and while she washed her hair, she felt some movement, and eventually watched 3 huge spiders go down the drain. She had slept all night with the spiders in her hair. Story 3. Our elderly neighbor fell sick and had to go to the hospital. Her niece asked us to take care of her dog while she was away. So after schoolwork and dinner and all that, my brother and I were sent over to make sure he was doing all right. It was late at night, in this weird old lady's house. My brother was in the shed with the dog, and I was in the living room looking at the creepy old photos on the mantelpiece. What follows is true. I heard the door creak, and then a woman's voice called out my dog's name. I freaked out, turned around. Of course, there was no one there. I thought maybe it was the neighbor's niece. But then, I went out to my brother and the dog, and he was freaking out too, because he thought that he heard a woman's voice right outside the shed. We both agreed that we definitely heard a voice. We left the dog in the shed, went home, and were greeted by my dad, who told us that the neighbor's niece had just called to say that the neighbor had passed away in the hospital just a few hours ago. Story 4. My neighbor at my old apartment was a state park ranger for years, and is now retired. Apparently, when he first got the job, there was a younger kid who went missing while on a camping or hiking trip. They organized a huge search of the area, to no avail. No clues or anything. The kid was just missing. A few years go by, and some evidence turns up that wasn't in the direction they originally searched. The evidence they found was part of his camping equipment. On his off time, my neighbor took to searching the area where it was found, hoping for more clues. Just outside the state park lived a couple in a very run-down trailer, who were quite reclusive and odd. One day my neighbor had to talk to them about something unrelated to the missing kid. He was in their trailer, which is a mess of junk, no running water, etc. While he is in there, he realizes that the ashtray sitting on a table looks very unusual. He looks closer and realizes that it's a skull, and it looks small. There is this investigation into the couple, and here is where things get really weird. An investigation shows that they were innocent of killing the kid. He probably died of exposure or dehydration. Apparently, this guy came across the body afterwards, and his dogs were after it. When he took the skull, it was really recent after death, and apparently still had features, hair, everything. The guy took it and defleshed the damn thing and took the top of it to use as an ashtray. Apparently, he was well aware that there was then a current search for a missing child, and could recognize the kid from the pictures, but it never dawned on him or his wife to go to the cops and inform them of their find. He just saw an opportunity for an ashtray. Apparently, he showed them where the remains were, and they scrounged together enough for burial, but kept it quiet so that the family didn't know that some guy put out his Marlboros in their kid's head for 5 years after letting his dogs eat his remains. Story 5. My sister and I were playing outside when we were younger, and an elderly couple was walking by our yard. Our yard had a cemetery in the back, so it was quite a common local attraction for tourists, as this house was built in the 1800s, and most of the graves were from children who died back then from the flu. Playing outside, the old couple kept pestering my sister about what her name was as they approached us and got closer. We were just little kids, but got terribly scared, and ran inside and told our mom what had happened. The following week, I heard a story on the news about an elderly couple approaching a teenage girl, kidnapping her, and murdering her, and it was the same couple that had approached my sister and I. Story 6. My mother-in-law was a very funny and cool woman. She and my wife were really close, and sadly, she passed away when our son was about 4 months old. Fast forward a few years. We live in an old 1930s era craftsman house in Pasadena, California. Our son is about 3 years old at the time. I was giving him a bath one night, and he starts looking over my shoulder. Not at random stuff, but his eyes were fixed on something. A moment passes, and he asks me why Grandma calls Mommy a funny name. Long pause. I asked him what he meant, thinking that he was talking about my mom. He then says, "Why does Grandma call Mommy a funny name?" I was really set back by this. My wife and I never used the nickname, and it was just what her mom called her since she was a baby. I asked him where he heard the name. His reply, "The farmer told me." I asked him who the farmer was, and he replied, "His friend." I tell my wife this story later, and she's of course reduced to tears over the whole nickname thing. We both know there is no way for him to know what the nickname was, and we were completely at a loss of words. Fast forward to the next weekend, and my son is playing in his bedroom. My wife is at work. I hear him start talking, like he's having a conversation. He's saying things like, "Yes, no, I don't know," and then I can also hear him laughing. I go into his room and ask him what he's doing, and he says that he's just playing. I ask with who, and he says, "The farmer." At this point, I'm already thinking about the Exorcist movie. It's a little unsettling. I ask him where the farmer is. He says that he left when I came in the room. What the hell? So my wife gets home, and I tell her this, and now she's just as weirded out as I am. We have no idea what to do, and figure if it happens again, then we'll do something. A few days later, in the middle of the night, we both hear our son saying the following: "Grandma says you and I can't be friends anymore." The wife and I go check on him, both of us a little freaked out. He's just sitting up in bed. I'm asked if he's okay, and he says yeah. Grandma says I can't play with the farmer anymore. He never one time mentioned the farmer again. Not ever. He's 13 now, and doesn't remember any of it. Story 7. When I was young, about 11 years old, my sister, whom is 7 years older, would babysit me when my parents were out. At the time, she smoked a lot, and my parents made her smoke outside, of course. So I would follow her outside into the carport which faced the street and play around, annoy her and such. One day my sister notices a car at the end of the driveway, just sitting in the middle of the road. It's a white SUV with a bike rack on top. It has the darkest tinted windows I have ever seen. You could not see anything inside. It sat there until we went inside, and then would drive to the end of the road and sit at the church parking lot and wait. Wait until she would come out again for another smoke. And it would repeat this over and over. Odd, but my sister was very brave, and just kind of ignored it. That is, until the next day while my parents were out again, and it showed up again. It would sit at the end of the driveway, and just watch. I don't know what the driver was doing, but he was definitely watching my sister. If I didn't go out with her, I would watch from the front window, and it would just sit there the entire time she was outside. She eventually told my father, who was a sheriff deputy at the time, and he called the cops and made a complaint. They showed up and looked around, but the SUV was nowhere to be seen. Months went by, and nothing. And then one day, a good 9 months after this had all started, it was back. It again became a regular occurrence. Another day, my sister was outside doing her nasty habit, and sure enough, there it was. We were alone as usual, and this time, she decides she's had enough. She tells me to stay in the carport, and she's going to go confront them. She starts walking toward the SUV, and halfway down the driveway, she would later remark, "I felt utter terror, like I knew if I went any further, I was dead. I was paralyzed by fear." She turned around and went inside. Finally, the family car was in the shop for some kind of issue, so we were all stuck home for a night, and had to get delivery for dinner. While my parents are home, my sister goes outside to smoke. I go outside with her, and eventually the SUV shows up. She tells me to run inside and tell my father, and I do. My dad promptly gets his gun and starts briskly walking down the driveway with it in hand. The SUV floored it down the road and peeled out onto the nearby highway. My dad, being a cop, noted the year and model and distinguishing features. The scariest thing? The license plate had been covered with duct tape. We never saw it again. Story 8. I grew up in a house on Long Island in the town of Brentwood. It was a quiet town for its location. My dad worked as a taxi driver at the time, which meant he would usually end up coming home early in the morning, and I would greet him. So it's Saturday. I'm watching cartoons, and my dad comes in, and I run to say hello. My mom hears us from the bedroom and says, "Hey honey, don't go in the pool. It's not ready yet." My dad and I think that's weird. It's 6 a.m., and we weren't going to go to the pool. We brush it off, and he goes on to tell me his usual stories of the crazies that he had picked up throughout the night. We then realized it was Saturday. My mom was at work, and it was only me and him in the house. Fast forward a couple of weeks, and my new neighbors come over to welcome us into town since we had just moved in recently. It was the 2 mothers, 2 sons, and 2 little girls. I was playing soccer with the kids, however the little brunette girl is nowhere to be found. The curious little kid I ran around the property, and I find her playing in the woods. Definitely a dangerous area for little girls to be exploring. She asks me to come play tag, but I decline, wanting to get everyone in on the game. The reactions of everyone as I asked them to join us was puzzling, along with the response from their mom. We only have 1 daughter. As it turns out, a small brown-haired girl drowned in the pool 10 years ago. The mother died of a heart attack not too long after this happened. Story 9. This is my good friend's story, and he is definitely not known to make up things. His story happened when he was about 8 years old. He was playing hide and seek with his friend at his house. It was late, probably around 10 o'clock. It's my friend's turn to find his friend. He's looking everywhere around the house, but he can't seem to find him anywhere. He eventually decides that he must be hiding outside, so he leaves the house to find him. He starts searching around some bushes, when he hears his friend's voice coming from a dark corner, maybe 20 feet away. The voice calls for him to come over. He didn't, because he was already pretty spooked being outside in the dark. My friend yelled back, "Come over here." That's when he said he really got scared. My friend kept saying no over and over again. At this point, he said that the voice suddenly changed to a dark, horrible-sounding voice demanding him to come over there. At this point he ran back inside the house, only to see his friend standing in the living room. When questioned how he got inside so fast, the friend said that he never went outside, whatever that voice was. It scares me every time I think about his story. Story 10. About 9 or 10 years ago, I was friends with this guy that ran an event center. He would host gaming parties on Friday nights, and usually it would be packed. The place was located inside an old shopping mall, and you had to access it through the back door, where the night guard would let you in and out. So this Friday, we all go and we're having a blast. I decide to go for a food and drinks run before all the shops close, and I take everyone's orders. I head out the back door, and the back door is locked. I wait a minute and then call out for the guard. He appears from behind the door of his office and lets me outside. I go and then come back, and he's waiting for me. He opens the door, and I go back to the party. The weekend passed by, and on Monday, I decide to go hang out at the event center for a few minutes after school. I walk in the mall, and there's cops everywhere, and an awful stench. The shops were closed, and the cops wouldn't let me stay for long, so I just decided to go back home. That night the news reported that there was a murder at the shopping mall. A lady that managed the place found out that one of the guards was stealing, and that after she confronted him, he killed her and stuffed her in garbage bags inside his locker. The murder took place that Friday that I was there, and forensics estimate the time of death at around 9:10 p.m. My heart stopped. The news showed a picture of the murderer, and I immediately recognized him. It was the usual night guard. I get the shivers from just remembering this. The time of death overlaps the time in which I went out for a food run that Friday night, and the back door was just a few feet away from the office in which the murder took place. Story 11. Back in high school, I was part of our school's cheer squad. During the summer before the new school year started, we would all go to cheer camp and learn some new routines or stunts and compete with other cheer teams. Now, I really wasn't a typical cheerleader. I liked my space and didn't get rowdy with the others during our off time. I preferred to read or listen to music by myself in a room I shared with 2 other girls. During these down times, all the other girls were always across the hall listening to music and going nuts. They always did this with their door open, so I kept mine closed so I could have some peace and quiet. I was laying on my stomach in front of my boombox with my head facing away from the dorm door. All of a sudden, I hear a female whisper, "Turn around." I turned around, and no one was there. I go back to what I was doing, and again, I hear someone whisper, "Turn around." I figure I'm hearing voices carry over from the hallway, as the voice did sound like one of the girls on my team. I open the door to have a look outside, and surprisingly, the hall is empty, and the door across the way is shut. It couldn't have been her. Again, I go back to what I was doing. This time, when I hear the voice whisper, "Turn around." Again, it was followed by 2 hard taps on my right shoulder. I get up and look around. There is no one in the room. I go look in the closet that was closest to where the dorm door was. It was a shared closet that led to the next room that was occupied by our coach. No one was in there either. I figure, screw it. I'm not staying in this room tonight, so I go across the hall into the other room. Everyone is busy doing their thing. I tell my friend about it, and she keeps telling me to tell everyone about it, but I chose not to. It happened to be the last night of our stay there, and our coach and one of her friends were telling ghost stories. The last story they tell us is how the area where we had all been practicing, in front of a white gazebo, was where a wedding was supposed to have taken place. Something about some people that had donated a lot of money to the school had built it for their daughter's wedding. Their daughter ends up finding out that her fiancé was cheating on her, and she hung herself from the gazebo. I thought it was interesting that the gazebo was the first thing I noted when I was assigned my room. It was right outside my window. I don't know how true this story was, but I loved how the smiles and laughter completely fell from my coach and her friend's face when my friend had me relate my story. No one slept in that dorm room that night. Story 12. My parents were on a trip to Europe. They are getting older and have plenty of money so they can travel wherever they want. I was taking care of their house. I was home for the summer from school anyway, so it was fine. I had been there for a few weeks and it was pretty quiet. I just went to work, came home, had some time with my boyfriend, enjoying the house to ourselves. But one night, I was just laying there watching TV when I heard this really weird, low whistling sound coming from the window that was just behind the couch. It struck me as sort of odd and I just sort of shrugged it off. But then, it happened again. It totally sounded like there was a person standing at the window, whistling. I looked out the window, and of course there was no one there, so I figured I should go check it out. If it were something like the wind on the siding, I wanted to fix it because that would become annoying. So I walked out into the backyard. The backyard at my parents' house is this super beautiful, sparse sort of forest that leads to a road on the other side. So I looked at the house and didn't see anything. But then, I heard the sound again. It was coming from the woods in the back. I was pretty creeped out at this point, and of course I couldn't see anything in the woods. So I hurried back through the door and locked it behind me. I never really heard the sound again for a few days. Until one night, I was asleep in my room, and I could have sworn I was awakened by the whistling sound against the second floor window. I listened hard, and it was dead silent. So I decided I should go ahead and look out the window. I did the whole thing where I crept super slowly towards the window, and just sort of peeked through it. Outside my window, there was a man standing there. I was really sleepy, so I can't know how much of this I'm just misremembering, but he was just sitting there staring at me. I was completely frozen, and slowly, the man pursed his lips, and I could hear the whistle again. It was crystal clear, and made me feel like crying. I tore myself away from the window and hid under my covers. The next night, I insisted that my boyfriend stay with me, which he did, and of course nothing happened. He figured that I was just tired and delirious. It gets kind of anticlimactic from here, but I didn't hear it for another week or so, and when I did, I was alone. It was just a small whistle, happening randomly, coming from a wall or something. It just happens every week or so, and it always freaks me out tremendously. The weirdest part is that I kind of have started doubting the accuracy of my memories, particularly my encounter with the whistling man. Story 13. The summer between my freshman and sophomore years of high school, a friend of mine and his family moved in with his grandma. They were buying a house that ended up having to have some work done, so his grandma invited them to live with her while they waited for the house to get finished. She had a beautiful big house, and it was just her and my friend's cousin that lived there, so there was plenty of room. My friend's cousin was 2 years older than me, and was going into her senior year of high school. The house's living room had a vaulted ceiling with floor-to-ceiling windows on all sides. It looked amazing, but gave you no real privacy. It wasn't a big deal though, because the house sat about 500 feet off the road, and had wood surrounding it on all sides. Shortly after my buddy and his family moved in, I went over on a Saturday to spend the night. My buddy's room was small, so we decided to sleep on the 2 couches in the living room. Just as we are getting ready to go to sleep at about 1 a.m., we see someone walk past the window outside. We get his dad, who shuts off the lights in the house. About 100 feet away in a tree line, you can see a small red light as 2 people pass a cigarette back and forth. They are just standing there watching the house. His dad calls the police and then opens the front door and yells, and the 2 guys take off. The police find nothing over there. The woods are full of little game trails, so there is no telling where the guys went. The interesting thing is that there are only 3 houses within about a mile of this house, and none of them have older kids. One has very small children, and the other 2 have no kids at all. So we have no idea where the people came from. A few weeks later, another friend and I both spent the night there. The 3 of us walk into the living room at about 10 p.m. to watch a movie, and there is a guy standing, looking into the window. He sees us and then runs off. Again, we can see the lights of the cigarettes in the distance. Over the course of that summer, there were multiple encounters with these watchers. There were 3 places they would come and stand, and we never could forecast if they would come or where they would go. They would knock on the windows sometimes. Once they shook the front door so hard it set off the burglar alarm. At times we would just see them in the tree line watching the house. Once, they took lipstick and wrote, "Hello," on the window. During the day, we combed the woods trying to find them, but never could. We thought it was likely guys from our school trying to catch a glimpse of my buddy's cousin in her bikini or in her underwear because she was really hot. But it would have been a hell of a lot of effort just to maybe catch a glimpse. We never found out who it was. Eventually the house my buddy's family was buying was fixed, and they moved. Who these watchers were and what they wanted is still a mystery, and always will be. Story 14. A few years ago, my friend Tez and I set out on a great American road trip. We were going to drive from New York to Los Angeles, zigzagging through the country for 6 weeks. We were both in our early 20s, pretty broke, and as my mom had been a long-haul trucker, I suggested that we save a ton of money and we should sleep in the back of our hatchback. It was a pretty cozy setup. We bought some blankets and sheets at Goodwill and cut them up to make curtains. By the end of the first week, we had gotten this setup, camp, in about 10 minutes. We had our luggage moved to the front, curtains up, bedding laid down, and out for the night. We slept in parking lots, free camping sites, rest areas, and basically anywhere it seemed safe and semi-legal. There was never a night, after the first night, where we felt scared. Until the last week on the trip, in Arizona. We were near Flagstaff and had gotten pretty used to our routine. We didn't go out on a set schedule and never worked or drive more than 3 or 4 hours a day. No destination really in mind, outside of a few must-see landmarks. We'd drive to places we found at night before on Google and take suggestions from other campers, locals, and people we met. We'd also gotten very good at making friends. We went to Denny's with a group of rednecks and met a campsite. In the back of their pickup, because I got hungry and overheard them saying they were going to go, we met an 80-year-old cowboy who took us out to drinking and taught us to line dance at a country bar. We played the guitar with some musicians in the middle of a thunderstorm, got fed breakfast and dinner by tons of campers who invited us to hang out with them, and spent the 4th of July with a family who basically adopted us into their campsite. Basically, every encounter we had with a stranger was a positive one. This night didn't look to be any different. We found a free campsite on Google and drove up into the woods, following our GPS. We were pretty far out of town and something seemed a little bit off when we pulled up to our campsite. There was one RV parked and 2 cars further up in the trees. We pulled up near the RV and a man opened the door. Taz waved hello and he just stared at her. His expression was completely blank. Then, as if he hadn't said anything, he just slowly closed the door again and stared at us through the window. I was figuring he just wanted some privacy and he thought we'd be obnoxious. We pulled farther down the road and found a flat spot to park the car. Instead of our usual routine of setting up camp immediately while there was still light out, we gooped around for a little bit, smoking and laughing and taking dumb photos of ourselves. Taz pointed out that a campfire farther down the campsite, and we decided to go be friendly. We'd met so many cool people in the previous 5 weeks by just going up and offering beer or just chatting, so we wandered over. Near the campfire were 2 men, the owners of the cars we'd seen earlier. They seemed friendly and we sat down and chatted with them. They were drinking and smoking, so we sat down and had a beer with them. One of the men seemed pretty off and we came to find out that 2 of them didn't actually know one another. The older man was definitely on some sort of drugs. He was spinning in circles and talking about UFO, and however, they seemed harmless. This left us chatting with the younger man who claimed to be a former park ranger. He was handsome and easygoing, and we spent several hours just chatting about our trip, families, and everything. Then he started talking about the bear. He'd seen a bear earlier in the forest. Tez didn't believe him, and he pulled out his camera to show her some photos of the bear. It was very close to the campsite, and we both were a little freaked out. It wasn't occurred us for one of us to get up and go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, so the idea of a bear hanging around in the night spooked us. The ranger just laughed, and then his expression changed completely. It's hard to describe, but his voice seemed somehow cold. He said, "If you get out of your car in the middle of the night, it's not a bear you should be worried about." I kept waiting for the laugh and for him to nudge Tez with his elbow. Jokes on the foreigner, and they say the city girl, right? He never did. I laughed awkwardly and made a dumb joke about serial killers in the woods. My friend laughed as well and joked about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We moved to another subject. Within 5 minutes, the ranger had come back to it and was talking about something grabbing us from our car in the middle of the night. No matter how we tried to steer the conversation away from serial killers, he kept latching back on. Don Norman was high as a kite at this point and was staring at the stars, not talking. We just awkwardly laugh and sip our beer and try to get the conversation going somewhere else. Then the ranger stood up and walked towards the cooler to get another beer. At this point it was pitch black out, and I can't see anything outside the circle of light from the campfire. The beer cooler was outside the circle. Suddenly there is a red dark in the darkness. And it took a moment for me to realize that it's a camera. The ranger is holding a camera. He had taken a photo of us. I could see the screen on the digital camera light up. Now it wasn't very awful for people that we met to take pictures with us. My friend Tez is gorgeous. Dark hair, blue eyes, with like a young Megan Fox. And we were pretty friendly. People like having pictures of themselves too. It was an extremely strange thing to have this person taking pictures of us without asking or even indicating that that's what he was doing. We were both staring at him like deer in headlights at this point. But instead of realizing what he was doing is a bit weird, he checks his camera, adjusts some things, and takes another photo. This time with the flash. Not asking us to smile or proposing a group photo, and no explanation. After this photo he comes back and sits down by the fire. Not a word said about the photo. At this point, me and Tez are mutually freaked out. We make some BS excuse that we need to go set up our campsite and milk the hell out. When we stand to leave, the UFO guy smiles and says, "Have a good night." Ranger, however, looks at us and smiles and doesn't reach to anything. He just says, "Be careful out there. There's more than bears in the woods." Every hair on the body stood on end. I was alone in my discomfort, either because Tez laughed a response out and pulled me away from the campfire towards our car. We rushed back to the car, which we only found in the dark by referencing the RV, and jump in the front seats. My friend Tez is all about hyperventilating. Why did he take pictures of us? I was shaking. I responded, "I read the serial killer sometimes warn their victims." She stared at me for a second and locked the car doors. "Do you think he just took victim photos of us?" We both freak out. She's in full panic mode, turns on the headlights of the car, and I immediately yell her to turn them off because now he knows exactly where our car is. God knows why, but that's the only night we used not to set up our camp. We didn't need to tear anything down, So we just got out of there as soon as light came. As we got into the dirt road, the ranger was walking towards our car and with that same cold expression. So I hope I never meet that ranger again. Story 15. When I bought this property a couple of years ago, one of the main selling points was the woods. Between the house and the road are rows and rows of red pine, roughly 5 acres, and standing maybe 35 to 40 feet tall. Walking through these woods gives off an eerie feeling, but enjoyable still. The ground covered by many thick needles giving off a spring step when trekking through. Behind the home are more of a wild side landscape with many different trees, a creek, and a winding path that's just wide enough for a small utility vehicle. These woods the kids and I enjoyed most. We have done a few projects such as build a small wooden bridge to get to the other side of the creek. We made a rope swing, and they all have their own battery-operated vehicles to drive the path if they wanted to. One thing we did do last year looking back is we found a huge pile of rocks in the middle of nowhere. The rocks varied in size from a handful to a little over a bowling ball size. Well, we were pulling rocks off that pile as if there was something buried inside. We never found anything other than more rocks. The pile of rocks was maybe 10 feet long, 8 feet wide, and maybe 3 feet tall. We dug down deep enough to see the rocks that were buried in the ground, so we stopped. I am thinking now that maybe it wasn't such a good idea. In recent past, our family had dealt with something I thought would never happen, and that was a ghost or ghost in our home. The first story written explains the details in that, but this happened in my home. I and my wife talked about this with friends and family, but nobody else after that. I live in a small city, and talking with them, stories of this property began slowly coming out of the woodwork. The following stories below are accounts from what we heard happening in these woods. My wife spoke to her sister and her sister's husband. Her husband recalls 3 stories of the previous owner's experience. 2 of them, he claims he can't remember, but I am taking it as either he's making it up to scare us or he just refuses to tell. The one experience he did say was the man that lived there chose to never take trees from the woods. The main source of heating for the house is a wood stove. He never hunted these woods either. I spoke to a friend of mine, who we will call Bert's, about the haunted house incident. Bert's has been hunting in the woods behind this property for many years, and decided to tell me of his experiences of what has happened to him and many hunters including his young nephew now. Going out in the early hours before sunrise, everyone seems to see a silhouette of a man walking around, and when approached, he disappears. Other accounts are there is a light they see about the side of a credit card flying around, and that too often, when approached, disappears. The one event that kind of sent chills up his spine was one morning he was up in a tree, all set up and waiting as hunters do. He saw the light down below the bottom of the tree just sitting there, so he called out and asked who it was. He got no answer. He became angry that this person was messing with his hunting sight, so he began to threaten him or her. The light stayed right at the bottom, so Bert's climbed down, and as he climbed down, he saw the light move away. He said he chased this light a good 40 yards or so, then it just disappeared. He says he remembers standing there in a thick fog, and all of a sudden, debris from up above the tree such as leaves, twigs, and other things came falling down upon him as he looked up. This huge gust of wind, strong enough to almost knock him down, came rushing in. He says he doesn't hunt alone anymore. Another friend, who was a volunteer for the fire department, told me they were called out there about a fire about 6 years ago. Apparently, half of those houses caught on fire, but luckily, no one was hurt or in the home at the time of the fire. He said it was strange because they could not find the source of the fire. He said that while they were there, he saw someone standing just inside the yard by the woods for a glimpse, and when he turned to catch up with them, there was no one there. He said he had an eerie feeling about the woods. He told his supervisor about it, but they never believed him. They thought maybe it was just some kind of smoke inhalation or something causing him to see that. Okay, these are the stories I've heard during my time. I have not had any experiences myself in these woods, nor my kids, but recently an event has happened with someone I know from work. I have had some raccoon problems in the last few weeks as well. We have, or should I say, have 6 chickens. In 2 evenings, we had lost 2 to the raccoons. We know they are raccoons because we saw them from the 2nd floor looking out the window in the evening. A co-worker of mine, who we will call Billy, overheard me telling another about losing my chickens, and he had offered his services to come out and exterminate them. Awesome. We agreed for him to come out on a Saturday evening, and he and his friends would come out and camp out for a couple of hours around the chicken coop late at night to pick off them as they came. Around 8:30 in the morning, they pulled into the driveway, got their gear, and decided to change plans. Because the layout of the property in woods, they first were going to check the abandoned camper, then patrol the pines, then patrol the woods in the back. Within 10 minutes, I received a text from them saying they got a huge one in the camper, and were now going to patrol the pines. I replied with, "Great job, guys, but be careful in the pines. There are a couple of deep bunkers with the pines, and you don't want to trip on them, because you could get really hurt." About 15 minutes later, I walked out on the deck from the 2nd floor and saw them coming back. I asked how it went, and they told me they thought they better come back to the house. What had happened was that they walked deep within looking up the pines to pick them out of the trees, and they heard branches and needles crunching from what they thought was a coyote. They looked down in the snow, and they had seen some tracks. The noises grew, and it seemed like there were more than one now. They felt that they were being circled, worried that they stumbled upon a den. They hightailed it back to the house. They said they were going to walk into the backwoods now. I thought maybe this wasn't a good idea, so I tried to talk them out of it. I told them I had heard stories of those woods in the dark. Their reply was that they have dealt with scary things in the woods before, and that they would be fine. Okay then, good luck on your journey, and I shall see you on the other side, I told them, and I went back inside. About 10 minutes later, I received a text. "We are leaving." I walked outside to catch up with them before they left for the night. Before they walked down the woods, I saw 2 young men with their firearms, confident and all rambled up for the extermination. When I saw them on the return, they were 3 shades whiter, eyes wide open, and they were talking so fast I had to ask them to slow down. One of them just put his guns away and got right into the truck. Billy explained to me what had happened. They walked down the path, and while walking, they felt they were being watched. They heard a big crack of a branch on the ground behind them. They quickly turned around and flashed their spotlight and saw nothing. No noise of an animal running away, no broken branches, just nothing. They continued down the path, and about midway, Billy saw what had looked like a glowing white blob. He says, roughly about 5 feet tall and hovering. They flashed a light on it, and it looked like it moved so fast it was a blur and disappeared. Talking to each other, asking if they saw it, and just then, the branches and twigs crunched behind them. The other saw it again, and as they flashed the light, again it disappeared. This happened 2 more times, each time appearing to get closer and closer. It was messing with them, appearing behind them. This was when I received a text, and they ran back to the house. Billy told this story to many co-workers at my place of employment, and of course he got a hard time for it. No one believes his story, nor mine, of the house, and that's okay. There are now 3 guys at work who are planning on walking the woods to debunk his story. I am unsure if this is a good idea or not, but I am leaning towards letting them. Yesterday, I had told a friend online about what's going on in the woods. She told me it may sound crazy, but she may have an idea of what it is. She is into fae lore. She told me it sounds like a dark fairy. She doesn't remember the name, but she's thinking it's a marrow fairy. She says that this fairy, which can be 5 foot tall I guess, walks the woods and eats bones. Bones from animals, of course, that have been killed. She says they protect their woods from their stash. They normally don't harm humans, but are known to play and chase. A way to test it would be bringing a chicken bone, throw it away into a circle, and see if it's gone the next day. I am leaning more of a ghost than a fairy, but what do I know? Story 16. I'll start by telling you a few things about me. I'm 18 years old and live in northern Canada, in 2 different homes. One is with my father, who lives right in the middle of 222 acres of woods. We've got but a single neighbor, who is situated about a kilometer away. My second home is with my mother. She lives on the edge of a city, close to the woods and the main shopping center. The story is split into 3 parts, and believe me, it may sound crazy, but I swear, all of this is true. The first part of the story starts at my father's house. I'd often go for walks in the woods. It was peaceful and quiet. I'd always bring my 3 dogs for protection, a German Shepherd and 2 Australian Shepherds. Nothing ever happened in the woods. There was the occasional sighting of bears, and we found quite a few lynx tracks, but nothing out of the ordinary, until something started watching me from the woods. A black figure of sorts. At first, I thought it was just my paranoid mind playing tricks on me, so I shrugged it off. A few days passed since I first felt the strange watching presence. It was a cold day out. The sun was gone, and the wind came from the north, making it even colder. It was around noon, and it was time for me to bring the dogs out for a walk. I brought them down to the road that leads to my house. Nobody was around, and it was silent all over, except for the wind blowing through the tree leaves. I was calm, but then it felt like I was being followed. Of course my dogs were following me, but this feeling was dark. I continued, and eventually turned back to go home. Everyone was gone, so I arrived to an empty house. As I was about to bring the dogs into their kennel, I noticed one of the horses was frozen in place. He was staring into the woods. I tried to get his attention, but he would not budge. I walked over to him, patted his head. He only growled, but not to me. He growled to whatever was in the woods. The dog was pacing, tail tucked between his legs and ears held back. That made me feel a little uneasy, since I had been feeling watched or followed during the walk. It also meant I wasn't the only one who felt it. I decided to be safe and locked the door when I was inside. I'd like to say this feeling left after a while, but no. It only became more frequent. I had to lock and cover my windows at night because it felt as though someone was peering through them. I told people about it, especially those I lived with. They'd tell me it was a bear or maybe some ghost. A few even mentioned that it could be a stalker. I knew it was neither of these things. It just didn't feel right. Fast forward to about 3 months after the first occurrence. It's September, and the weather has begun to get colder. I was outside with my dogs cleaning some skulls I had recently gotten from a trapper. I was just minding my own business. All of my family members were gone, so I was left alone again. Then I went near the forest and felt the dark presence again. It was so strange. I just couldn't shake it off as nothing. Scared, I went inside and decided to make myself some food in the comfort of my home. The fear left, and I felt safe again, until I heard the dreadful sound coming from the woods outside. It sounded like a man screaming, a deer howling in pain, and the low growl of a bear all at once. It was the scariest thing I've ever heard in my life. I checked all the doors and ran to the second story of the house to hide. I'm not sure why I felt so much fear, since I heard nothing after that, but I called a relative, and they told me I was just hearing things. That night, I could barely sleep. I was afraid of whatever this thing was going to come inside. I kept seeing things in the shadows of the trees after this incident. It was hard to ignore. Eventually, I went to live with my mother in the city. I was there for a better chance at a job. I also had some friends to reunite with there. Once I moved, I met up with my childhood best friend. She and I decided to take a long walk in the chilly temperatures of the night. We talked and talked. Nothing happened until about 1130. We were crossing the street when I heard the same exact sound, but much louder, coming from the woods down the road. I was terrified. My friend, though, paid no attention to it. We continued walking, but I was a little more paranoid than before, just waiting for something to jump out after me. An hour passed, and we had to split ways. She went home, and I did too. I had some instrumental music playing on my phone to keep me calm. Obviously, that didn't last long. Of course, something had to happen in the dead of night while I was alone. As I walked in the streets, I heard a baby scream, but it didn't sound normal. It was a horrifying, distorted scream. I looked in the direction of the sound and thought I saw someone there. My feet moved faster than before, trying to get me home. Then I heard another scream, much scarier than the first. I ran for it. That might not have been the best decision, but it was instinctive. Suddenly, I heard feet hitting the pavement and felt like something or someone was chasing me. I looked back quickly and thought I saw a large black figure coming, but it only lasted several seconds until I saw nothing. The shouts and screams did not stop, though. I finally got home, but I realized the door was locked and couldn't get inside. Unfortunately, those screams continued. After many calls and pressing the doorbell, my stepfather opened the door. I was a hyperventilating mess, but I got through it. I'm very spiritual, and I've been told by many mediums or spiritual leaders that I am a beacon for bad spirits. I assumed that it was a bad spirit, but I remember reading about wendigos, a creature that is apparently connected to me in some ways that are unknown to me. I did research again and deeply believe that whatever followed me is still watching me. I'm not sure if it's a wendigo, but it could be. Some acquaintances agree that it is quite possible. Now I'm just waiting for my next encounter with it, and I'm left wondering, what does it want, and what will it do next? Story 17. Way back in 2000, I was a bored 15-year-old girl and began exploring AOL chat rooms. I had recently left public school and moved to a new city that I'd never been before. So, I was a bit lonely. I thought it would be cool if I could link up with people around my age in my new area. I've always been very cautious with my personal info, so I wasn't too worried about anything bad happening. I ended up meeting my boyfriend through one of those chat rooms. Things moved quickly, and I was soon pregnant and engaged. We got our own place, life was good, and we still used IM to message each other when he was at work, and frequently, we would also chat with our friends in the chat rooms. Some of my old online contacts would message me from time to time, but honestly, I mainly chatted with people I knew IRL. When our son was about 6 months old, we moved into a larger apartment. My fiancé Jake began working long shifts, and so I was home alone a lot with the baby. One evening, I was in a chat with a friend when someone else sent me an AIM. I wasn't sure who it was, but she began casually chatting with me and it seemed remotely normal at first. I was still confused as to who this was, and so she sent a photo. She didn't look familiar. I continued the conversation because I started to think maybe my fiancé and a friend were just messing with me because he liked to joke around a lot. Here's a bit of a dull, awkward conversation. Am I refusing to allow them to view my webcam? This person sends me a photo of a middle-aged man. Confused, I'm asked who it was and why they sent it. They gave me some line like, "Oh, that's my friend John, don't you think he's handsome?" I immediately knew that this wasn't right or a joke from anyone I knew. It was clear I'd been messaged by this guy all along, pretending to be another teenage girl. I initially cut off contact, but after a couple of days of thought, I was just creeped out and actually called and canceled my entire AOL service. A week or so after this, my brother-in-law, Mark, and his wife, Lynn, moved in with us. It was early evening on a Friday, and Mark and Lynn and I were getting some food and drinks before Jake got home. I was in the kitchen, and Mark was just a few feet away in the living room with Lynn. We were chatting and laughing when the phone rang. I answered it. It was a man. He greeted me by my first name in a very creepy tone, and seemed to be keeping his voice low. I had that feeling in the pit of my stomach that something was wrong. I asked, "Who is this?" Mark took notice and asked me who it was. He must have noticed the change of tone in my voice, because he glanced at me and went straight into his room to pick up on the other line to listen. The man on the phone must have heard Mark, because then he said, "Well, I see you have company," in a pretty disgruntled tone, and then he quickly hung up. I didn't have caller ID at the time, so we dialed *69 to get the number. When I called it back, it was a hotel in a neighboring city, about 15 minutes away. I asked the clerk who answered about the phone call I had received, but they informed me that there was no way to tell who sent that phone call, unfortunately. There's just too many rooms to tell. I knew it wasn't anyone I knew. My phone line was only active for a couple of months at that point. It was listed under my name, but I had only given it out to family and a few close friends. We didn't know who to make of it, or what to make of it. But later through that week, it was just forgotten. The week came and went. I'd received a couple calls from blocked numbers, where no one responded, but I tried to convince myself that it was simply worrying too much and that it was no big deal. We prepared for another weekend hanging out together. Again, Mark, Lynn, and I were home and Jake was still at work. We needed a few things from the store, so Mark volunteered to go get them while Lynn and I stayed in with the kids. Now, the small building we lived in had 3 apartments on the lower level, side by side, and 3 units above on the upper level. Kind of like a motel. Our unit was the last one to the right on the lower level and the furthest away from the parking lot. When you exit our apartment, to make your way to the parking lot, you walk down a cement walkway and pass the other 2 lower apartments. When you get to the end of the building, there's an area between the deck staircase to the upper level of the building and where the bicycles are stored. This is the only residential property in the area, and the surrounding businesses and office were closed at this time of evening. Mark exited the apartment, but came running back in just a few minutes later. He asked me if I was expecting more company. When I told him no, he told me this. Well, he told me that when he began walking past the other apartments into the lot, a man dressed in a dark clothing with a hood on had snuck out to the bicycle area and began walking towards our apartment with his head down. Once he noticed Mark coming straight towards him, he turned and ran. Mark chased him to the lot, but the guy took off into the darkness and he lost him. We all just sat nervously. That is when the man who called me, and that the man was the girl from the chat room. I just have no clue how he could have found out my number unless maybe I'd given it to someone previously, thinking that they were someone else but really it was him. I don't know how advanced people's hacking skills were back then, and if they could have found out my info through my AOL service. But I definitely regretted chatting away and left my board on. After this, we moved to an entirely different town, and I never listed a landline number ever again. Story 18. There was this house in my neighborhood that had a weird story to it that I had heard over and over growing up. A very old woman lived there, and no one ever really had seen her outside of her house in years. Of course, when there are children in a neighborhood with a house like that, kids are going to start spreading stories about the house. The most common one, of course, was that the old woman was an evil witch, and that she kidnapped children from the neighborhood and ate them. I won't lie and say that this story didn't scare me as a kid, because it really did, but no one ever saw the woman at all, or actually anyone go into and out of the house, and my parents told me it was just an abandoned house. When I was 12, I started hanging out with my friends later in the evening. We didn't really get into trouble, but we did get bored often. In early fall of that year, we had recently started back up at school. After a rowdy summer, we weren't quite ready to just settle down yet. So a couple weeks after school had started, we were hanging out late on a Friday night. And it just so happened to be Friday the 13th. So we were trying to find something scary to do. Of course, I was showing a bit of bravado that there was nothing that could scare me. Then my friend Paul and I began daring each other an escalating series of scary dares. So finally, Paul dared me to break into the old witch's house and scare her. There wasn't really anything scarier I could dare him, so I was pretty stuck with it. Yeah, I was nervous as hell as we approached the house. I tried to remember my parents telling me the house was just abandoned. There were never any lights on. There was never a car in the parking lot. There was never anything there to indicate that anyone had been in the house for a very long time. In order to not get caught, we snuck into the backyard of the house. It had a high fence, but once we got through it, it would give us cover in case anyone noticed us. Paul broke the lock on the fence door, and the 4 of us snuck in. We weren't doing a great job of being quiet though, so I kept expecting the back porch light to come on or something. Nothing did though. The back door was understandably locked. I felt that maybe I could bow out of the dare because we had already vandalized the fence. I didn't think we could justify damaging the door or one of the windows. However, that isn't how it worked out. One of the windows was unlocked, so Paul removed the screen from the window, and I had full access to get into the house. I climbed into the house. It was really, really dusty, and I tried to suppress a cough. I was absolutely sure at this point that no one lived in the house, but that didn't mean someone wasn't in there. And like any young kid, the possibility of there actually being a witch did remain on my mind. I walked through the kitchen, just surprised by the amount of dust and cobwebs in the house, but I was relieved to a degree as well. The unkept nature of the house just kept making me more positive that there was no one in the house. The floor creaked with every step, and I was positive that if there was anyone there, they would have to hear the creaking. It was obvious that someone, being me, was walking around in the house. I got in the hallway, and it was no better than the kitchen. There were some closed doors and a staircase in the middle of the hall. I had no intention on going up to the second floor, however. I'd just tell my friends that I did. There was an opening to a room at the far end of the hall. This is where I assumed that the living room must be. I decided that I would check it out, and then I would head back to my friends and let them know that the house was abandoned. I crept through the hallway and turned into the doorway. However, I stopped and didn't enter the room at all. There were bones all over the room. Bones all over the floor. Bones on the furniture. They were animal bones. There was no way any of them were human, but they were everywhere. I couldn't even step into the living room, since it was blanketed with them. They weren't like chicken bones either, something that could be rationalized by too much Kentucky Fried Chicken and no garbage can. There were many different kinds of animal bones there. I'm not sure how long I stood there, looking at the room, trying to figure out why someone would have a room like this. I've never seen anything so bizarre. I didn't check out the rest of the house. I just left immediately and told my friends what I had seen. They wanted to go in and check it out, but I told them I was not going to go back with them. I was way too creeped out. They eventually agreed and came with me. I really would never be able to guess what was going on there other than someone at some time did a thing for killing creatures and leaving their bones there, or who knows. I certainly don't, but it was weird. Story 19. I started camping at a really early age. My parents taught me the wonders of nature and how good it was to be out in it whenever I could. I grew up in a very rural area, so there was plenty of countryside to camp and time in. But also, one thing I learned from going out at such an early age is that I became very familiar with the wilderness, the animals, the birds, and everything that was in that area. That's important to know going into this story. I enjoyed camping so much that as I got into my teen years, I began going on many camping trips. The vast majority of them were just me being alone. My parents used to joke that when I got older, I'd probably end up as an old hermit out in the woods because I enjoyed being out there so much. When I was 15, I went out and decided to spend an entire weekend out in the hills. Friday was a holiday, so I had 3 days to be out there. I decided that I was going to go to this area that I had been to a few times. It was a very long walk, and I had to leave early in the morning in order to get there by late afternoon. It was a nice area by a creek that I always had a nice relaxing time by. Everything went normally for most of the evening. I built my fire, did a little fishing in the creek. I made myself some dinner, and then did a little writing in my journal. I really don't know what time it was, but it was pretty late in the night. I heard an ear-piercing scream. Shocked, I actually jumped up to my feet and looked around. The scream was so sudden and unexpected that I couldn't tell what had made the scream, nor from which direction it had come from. I waited, expecting to hear it again, but it didn't come right away. A bit unnerved still, but thinking it might have just been a loon, I sat down and tried to get back to writing again. I was probably sitting there for another 10 minutes before I heard another scream coming from the woods. This time, I had been expecting to hear it again, and I immediately knew that it was not a loon. It was a human scream, and it was a pained human scream. This time, also, there was more than one. I could also tell which direction they were coming from. The scream continued for a short period of time, before stopping again. I wasn't sure of what I could do at this point. I felt an obligation to check around, and if someone was in danger, to help him. But I was also a bit afraid that whatever was going on could happen to me as well. I didn't have a gun on me, but I did have a flashlight and a fillet knife. It took me a while to finally get up the guts and realize that if I was in danger, I'd want someone to come and try to help me. I didn't know if the scream was from someone getting hurt by someone else, or maybe someone fell and broke their leg or something. I didn't know, but I felt really obligated to find out. I set out with the knife and sheathed. I went into the direction I heard the screams coming from. The light wasn't that powerful. It was a really standard handheld flashlight. I could see right in front of me, but not far in front of me. I crept out in the direction of the scream. I shined the flashlight out, and even yelled, "Hello," and back towards the direction. It was quiet as I crept through the woods, trying to find the source of the scream. So far, though, there was nothing. The screaming had stopped right after I had called out, and was silent for a while. I began thinking I wasn't going to find anything, and it was then that I heard the screaming start up again, but this time it was coming from the complete opposite direction. I turned and went back through the woods towards my camp, and I have to admit it was terrifying turning my back to the woods that I had been creeping through as I headed back. Although the scream was coming from a different direction, I had my back towards the area that I had first heard it from. Pretty much all the way back to the camp, I was on edge, and when I got back to the camp, I noticed the screaming was not coming from the campsite. It was coming from further back. It sounded like the exact screaming I had heard in the first place, but why would it have made such a dramatic change in position, and it only happened after I had made my presence known? I thought about it for a long while. The screaming continued, but I had gone out into the woods once already. Everything just seemed really weird. I decided that whatever was going on, it was someone messing with me, so I decided I wouldn't go back out again. Instead, I sat down by the fire and kept a lookout around me, and I didn't sleep that night. After I had decided not to go back out into the woods, the screaming continued for roughly an hour. When it stopped for good, but the silence was just as terrifying as the screaming had been. In the morning, I went home early. This is really the first time I have told anyone this story, and I never found out anything had happened that night. Story 20. I really don't believe in intuition or psychic ability or anything like that. However, every now and then, you can have a feeling about something and act on it, and it will greatly benefit you. It's not really luck or anything. You just have to think about your circumstances. This happened when I was 15 years old. I'm an only child, and my parents had been wanting to go on a second honeymoon for a while. They were somewhat really protective of me, so they waited until I was much older to do it. I, on the other hand, was looking forward to spending some time to myself in the house. I rarely got such an opportunity. I'm a bit different than my folks. They like to keep the house lit up, and they tend to go to bed really early. They do this even on weekends, when they don't have to get up for work. I like sleeping in and staying up all night with the lights off. I always like the dark, and don't get why people would waste the dark by keeping lights on all the time. In the first couple days that I was in the house by myself, nothing really happened. I had a television in my bedroom, and I spent a lot of time playing video games or reading. On the third night, while I was upstairs in my bedroom, I suddenly heard a knocking at the door. I didn't have any idea who it could have been. I mean, I didn't know anyone who would come over without sending me a text message or something. All of my parents' friends knew that they were out of town. It was nighttime, so I assumed they weren't missionaries or something. After a few moments, I heard another knocking. A few moments later, a third knocking came. Then, it was quiet for a while. I figured whoever was there figured out that no one was home and simply left. A few hours went by, and I don't remember exactly what time it was, but I know that it was pretty late. As usual for me, I was walking around the house in the dark. I was in the kitchen at the back of the house with the refrigerator open. I was pulling out some items to make a snack when suddenly I heard another knock at the door. It was late, way later than I had ever known anyone to knock on my door. I began wondering if something had happened to my parents or something, so I got really worried for a few moments. But I thought, if it were the police giving me information about my parents, then they probably would have called me. Another knock came at the door. After thinking for a moment, I decided I'd better check and see who it was. I contemplated turning the lights on, but something stopped me from doing that, and I just had a bad feeling. So, I actually grabbed a large kitchen knife out of the cutting block and carried it cautiously into the living room with me. There hadn't been another knock, however. I did hear some noise. I resisted again, calling out. I crept over to the door, hearing some sounds and not really knowing what was going on. Again, I really wasn't positive why I was being so overly cautious, but I just felt really negative about the situation. I quietly crept up to the door and looked through the peephole. I nearly felt my heart stop when I saw there were 3 guys outside the door. The guy in front I couldn't really see as he was bent down and apparently, I assumed, trying to pick the lock. The other 2 guys, however, were wearing black and wearing hockey masks. It took me a moment to gather my sensibilities about me. I assumed, since I never made my presence known, that they must have assumed no one was home and were trying to break in. However, I didn't think making my presence known would have done myself any good, but I also didn't know how long it would take the guy to get in the door. I did the only thing I could think of. My parents, who I mentioned were overprotective, had a security system in the house. I went and quickly pushed the panic button. The alarm went off and it was a loud alarm. I couldn't hear over the alarm if the guy was still trying to pick the lock or not, but I figured because the noise of the alarm was drowning everything else out, I could run over and bolt the door too. I had been hesitant to do that at first because they would have heard it. I looked out the peephole and the 3 guys had scattered. The alarm did its job. The thing that gets me about this situation is that I was being so cautious about everything. I never answered the door. It never made my presence known, even before I knew 3 guys were trying to break into my house. This was a little unusual for me, but there was just something about the incident that made me not want to answer the door either time, and I am very glad I didn't. Thank you for listening, and I wish you good health. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us. Thank you very much.